Hey guys. All right, let's read chapter 5. The great spring festival was over in the palace of the High King at Tara, and all the guests had ridden away. Only the still vast household of Laoghaire, the High King himself, remained within the encircling walls that gleamed like a beacon to travelers still 2 days' journey off across the flat rolling plains of Meath. In the peace and quiet, after weeks of feasting and ceremonies and games, happy preparation was being made in the homestead of the chief judge against the homecoming of his eldest daughter. "That is good," said Macha's mother, and nodded contentedly as she watched the bondmaid spread the bed with fresh sheets of snow-white linen, newly bleached on the drying grounds beside the river. "That is good, Cathland. And the new curtains, you have them up?" Labrin of the long memory was a man of wealth and taste, and in spite of the laws of fosterage that laid down the standards of Macha's life with Sesnan, she would come home to fine surroundings, such as she had never known in the wind-swept dun beside the western sea. It was more the custom for sons to be sent out to fosterage, but Sesnan had been anxious for the honor of fostering a child of his illustrious kinsman, and there had been no more sons. Now it filled Breeze with happiness bright as the spring day to think of having the girl back again, and all her daughters gathered around her, if only for a little time. "She will be pleased with it, I think," she said to the bondwoman, and then sighed, almost sad that she could do no more. She came out through the big sunny greenan and down the steep stairs to sit a while in the sloping garden and watch for her husband coming to his evening meal. The wrath of Labrin lay, like all those of their senior members of the High King's household, close inside the outer walls of Tara on the low slopes of the hill, set in fair land of its own, with wide acres beyond the walls for pasture and cultivation. From where Breeze sat, she could see the whole long green sweep of the hill of Tara, crowned against the mild sky with all the vast buildings that were the home of the High King of Erin. Long before he saw her and lifted a hand in distant greeting, she could see her husband walking slowly down the green evening hill, followed by his servants, his clothes bright with the colors of his high rank. He walked with a light step of his alert good humor, pleased with his world, his head up to the soft air of the evening. She smiled and lost sight of him as she drew close to the rath, but she waited where she sat, knowing his habits, and it was not long before he arrived beside her, followed by a bondman bearing a deep silver cup of mead. He took it and drained it dry before he spoke, breathing out a long breath of content. "Ah, that was most welcome. Laoghaire, our king, was very kingly today, and a trial to the patience. I am tired." His wife smiled at him again and patted the stone seat beside her with a welcoming hand, the gold bracelets clinking heavy on her wrists. He was not our dear cousin Laoghaire then today. She was well familiar with the changing moods of the High King. At one moment, their amiable kinsman, and at the next, their monarch, remote and untouchable as the stars beyond the mountains. No, Labrin passed a hand across his face, and his wrist gleamed with deep bracelets of fine-worked gold. Slowly he relaxed beside Breeze. "No, he was very much a king today, and took a lot of my time, and I had much to do as I am traveling tomorrow to bring Macha from the dun of Sesnan." His long, intelligent face grew soft, and a smile touched the corner of his wide mouth. "It will be good to have her here with us again. The last time we were with her, I thought her to be growing very fair." Breeze looked at her husband and thought that not only Laoghaire the king had two faces and two sides to his nature. How many of the evildoers who were brought before the severe and stern-faced judge in the wrath of the Druids would recognize this soft-hearted and humorous man who so doted on his children. "Do you think we have chosen well for her?" she asked him, and Laban looked at her. "Chosen well for her?" he asked. "Oh, you speak of her husband?" "Yes," breathed my wife. "I am sure we have chosen well for her. Kian of the bright axe. He is everything she should be honored to find in a husband. Kinsman to the king himself, one of the mightiest warriors in the army, indeed a champion of the collar, the avenger of insults to the high king." He smiled a little. "And," he added, "he has enough knowledge of the tales and history of this land to please even me. Oh, he is well chosen, I think. She should be content with him. We do not want her driving her cows back round the hill, forsaking his dun when a couple of seasons are past. Sesnan tells me she has grown to a high spirit." Breeze looked shocked and peered into his face to see if he really meant what he said. "You jest," she said, relieved. "Of course she will be content with him. We will see her children, perhaps even the children of her children. We are young yet ourselves." Her face was gentle at the thought of her absent daughter and the fine young warrior who was to be her husband. He was tall, too. "He will be almost 2 hands taller than she is," she murmured. "That will be good. It is pleasing for a girl to be smaller than her husband." Laban's thick, fair eyebrows twitched, and he laid a hand on hers. "Yes," he said, "these things matter to you women. I cannot think how you are wed to one so undersized and ugly as I am." She smiled herself at that, and shook his hand a little about her own, and they sat together in silence and content, looking with pleased certainty into the future they had planned for their daughter. It was dark, and the family gathered for the evening meal when Sesnan came. Through the warm hum of talk and laughter in the hall, the urgent rumble of chariot wheels thundered in the quiet evening along the stone-built roads through Tara, and the high flare of torches threw their scarlet glare against the windows. "A curse on hospitality," grumbled Laban as he heard the commotion beyond his doors. "Who is it that I must entertain at this hour?" Breeze shushed him, and yet smiled a little, and from their own tables his children looked at him in shocked delight. Their father made a face at them, thrusting out his lower lip. "I am content as I am for tonight," he said. "Shush me not, good wife." He stretched his bare feet along the couch where he lay to eat, shifting the small yellow cat that purred against his ankles. "I am tired and warm, and the food is good, and I look forward to some music from my children when I am full. A curse again, I say, on hospitality." His eyes rested amused again on his little daughters, taking pleasure in their small grinning faces that so delighted to hear their father mock the very rules on which their life was laid. And he a judge! But even as he spoke and looked with tenderness at their giggles, he laid down the piece of meat that he was eating, and signed to a servant to bind on his sandals so that he might go properly to meet his unexpected guest at the door of his hall. But Sesnan was too quick for him, striding with desperate urgency through the wide doors into the peace and warmth and firelight, with trouble written on his drawn face, and his own company anxious and appalled behind him. Laban swung to his feet and came to him around the fire, stumbling a little on his sandal strings, the 4 tall candles flickering in the wind of his passing, lighting the surprise on his face. "Sesnan, my kinsman, greetings to you, and the welcome of my house. May there be always meat and drink for you, and land beyond your door." Despite his mischief with the children, he kept his curiosity in check until the rules of courtesy were honored, and he had greeted Sesnan with a kiss on both cheeks and led him to the fire, and only the sharp flicker of his eyes on the face of the older man betrayed the questions that raced through his mind. Breeze had stood up, her feet bare in the rushes, and the bright cushions of her couch tumbled to the floor unheeded. She knew trouble in this sudden visit, and spoke before her husband, her soft voice sharp with fear. "Maha," she said abruptly, and her hand went up to her to hold her throat, which seemed suddenly grown thick. Sesnan looked at her with his desperate eyes as the listening silence grew over the hall behind him, for it made it easier to begin on this dreadful news that could mean war and death inside their tribe. His pale, gentle face was haggard with distress as he looked from one parent to the other, trying to find words to tell them. Down the long hall the household gathered close, and the wild ones fingered their sword hilts and looked at each other hopefully with the light of pleasure in their eyes. Trouble over a foster child could lead to many a good battle, and life in Tara had been too still of late. Well, urged Laban when he did not speak. Well, what of Maha? His mind was waiting to hear of the child's death. Children often died of fevers in the spring, and there would be no blame to Sesnan or his good wife. He stared in bewilderment when Sesnan answered, barely feeling the deep-drawn breath of relief from Breeze at his side. She is gone, you say? He repeated stupidly, and the fair, heavy brows drew down over his eyes. What do you mean, she is gone? Anger was gathering in his strong face, and he stared at Sesnan in a new way. Once more, Sesnan trembled at the trouble he must bring. In this homestead, and in the whole place of Tara, life and belief were going on as they had gone on for more than any man's memory could count. How could he, a humble chief, find words to tell the king's Brehan about the prophecy and the fulfillment of it, the coming of Azhed from the sea, and of the way the man had sat at his fireside and stood in his fields, speaking such words of power and promise about a new world that he had been willing to give him his only son? Dumbly he lifted his hands in a hopeless gesture. Sesnan, my kinsman. Laban's voice was sharp. He was losing patience. You are a guest in my house, and it is not proper that I show you anger, but I bid you speak at once and tell me of my child and what has happened to her. I do not have to remind you that she was your foster child, and of your duties to her according to the law. If she is alive, why is she outside your house? Helplessly, Sesnan gathered his courage and began to speak, telling as best he could the whole strange story of the coming of the Azhed from the sea with his companions in fulfillment of the Druid prophecy, with their news of the new god. Breeze stared at him wide-eyed when he said he had given Bennett and spoke through the growing amazement around the fire. You allowed this Roman to take Bennett? She asked him in wonder and stared at her own eagerly listening children, for she knew what his only son had meant to Sesnan. The tired, frightened man looked back at her as though from her alone he might hope to get understanding of what had happened. I allowed Bennett to follow him when he had found a place to settle. I thought the man worthy of it. Breeze gazed at his haggard face, bewildered and unable to find anger against some unknown force so great that it had driven Sesnan to part forever with the boy who was the joy of his life. But Laban did not reason in that way, and faced his kinsman with his fair face darkening with fury. And Maha? Sesnan shrugged helplessly. She was content in everything until this Roman came. I had told her she was to go home and that her marriage was planned. Beside him, Breeze gasped, and her fingers flew to her mouth. In the anxiety about the child herself, she had for the moment forgotten to whom she had been offered in marriage. There was blood and war in this business, and no one could prevent it, and the poor, gentle Sesnan, who would raise a hand to none, must take the burden of it all. He was going on speaking, turning back defensively to the cold, accusing eyes of Laban. She was content, bright with happiness to come home, and pleased, I think, to face her marriage. But after this Roman priest had preached among us, she was like so many more of my people, confused and troubled and desperate to hear more, so that they might better understand the new way he taught, and the new God he spoke of. He sighed and looked from the furious father to the troubled mother. It never occurred to me, Sesnan went on, that she would try to follow him, but that is where she must have gone. Yesterday morning my son Bennett and many of my people left for Ulidia, where Patrick is settled with the chieftain Dichu, and she must have left with him. Although I bade my son farewell and watched them all go, I did not see her. When we could not find her, we searched for her everywhere, and an old woman came to Finola, my wife, an old woman who sews upon the household clothes since I myself was young, and knows them all. She told that in the crowd that left the dun, she saw a boy with red hair beneath his hood, and she was sure the clothes he wore were mine, long stored in chests until my son was grown. She thought him to be some poor lad to whom my wife had given these clothes for the journey. Now I know that it must have been Macha. And knowing her confused and sad over this man, should you not have watched over her all the closer? Laban's face was hard and cold, the face of the king's judge, and his voice was clipped. Sesnan looked old and defeated, his very hair limp with his distress. He raised two hopeless, pleading hands, and then closed them and let them drop. My son, he said, my son was going. In those few painful words, Breeze read all the grief and sadness that there must have been in that bright morning for him and for Finola, so that they neither saw nor thought of any other child except the brown-haired boy who was leaving them forever. She moved a step toward Sesnan, her face soft with pity, but Laban went on unmoved, concerned only with right and wrong. And where has she gone, you say? To the dun of Dichu, on the shore of the inland sea, which lies against the western sea itself, on the coast of Ulidia. Dichu has given the priest shelter and protection, and a great barn for a place for all to come and worship. He is a very powerful chieftain. Laban snorted and dug his hands inside his leather belt. I know of Dichu, and shelter and protection are what your Roman will need, my kinsman, by the time we reach him. Know you, Sesnan, what you have done in this? He drew himself up and glared under his heavy brows at his unhappy cousin, and around the edges of the hall, the candles in their cressets flickered on the bright, hopeful faces of those who had fingered their swords. I will tell you what you have done. You have neglected my child in fosterage, and so insulted me, and thus insulted the High King himself. Session's eyes widened, and Laban made a gesture of impatience. You are but a small chief's cousin, but you must know that an insult to the kinsman of the king inside his household is an insult to the king himself, and he will avenge it. We will wipe this Roman who has stolen my daughter and his henchman Dichu off the green face of Aaron, and that will be an end to this nonsense about a new god. We have long been expecting it, he added absently, and Seshnan's anxious eyes brightened a moment. There was an ancient prophecy by the Druids, he said, eagerly, as if to prove that the whole thing was outside the power of a humble man such as he. But Laban snorted again and looked at him almost with contempt. It was not a difficult one, my poor Sesnan, he said. Have we not known of this Roman religion for many, many seasons? Have we not heard of its power in the hot lands to the east? The Druids would be but poor creatures if they were not able to foresee that somebody, someday, would try to bring it over the western sea. There is no magic about this, my kinsman, but magic or not, there will be an end to it. The elements have served us well and all our forefathers, and will not forsake them for any god of Rome. As for your part in this, there was silence in the hall, and Sesnan stared at Laban in puzzlement, unable in this confused and frightened moment to think clearly of what he had said, or to sort out magical prophecy from common sense. Breeze watched his white and weary face and pitied him, in spite of her own fears for her daughter. It must have been something far beyond himself that had led his usual quiet wisdom into this, something so great that it had driven him to part with Bennett. She could not forget this, and moved a little toward Laban to beg him for pity. But she had no need. Laban was a just man, a judge in thought as well as deed. For your part, he went on, we will wait and see what comes out of it all. Our daughter herself should have known better than to go, and if we get her safely back, then we may overlook the folly that you did not watch her more closely. His voice grew gentler. You are older than I am, Seshnan, my cousin, and I have no desire to destroy your life and your home. For till this moment your house has served my daughter well. Seshnan did not speak, staring with bent head into the fire, overcome with sadness that there should be an end like this to all the happy years of Macha's life within his dun. His head jerked up at Laban's next words. But this does not rest with me alone, Seshnan. We have not told you to whom we are betrothing our daughter. The older man shook his head, not seeing that it mattered. To Kian of the bright axe. The last shreds of color drained from Sesnan's face. Yes, the avenger of insults to the king. Laban could not resist a moment of satisfaction, bouncing a little on the balls of his feet, his thumbs hooked again in his leather belt. A fine young fellow, and with being the bravest warrior in all Erin, he is as well versed in the tales and poems of history of his land as the king's Olavs themselves. He came back to the matter in hand, and now with the first shock of his anger past, and sound hope that his girl was safe, he looked almost in pity at the defeated man before him, and his voice grew gentle. So let us all hope, Sesnan, that we can bring Macha safely back to her home, for Kian will be avenging no vague insult to the king if she is harmed. He will be avenging his own bride, and the dun of Dichu, no matter how great, will flame into ashes above the head of this Roman from the sea, and the dun of Seshnan will surely follow it. Seshnan said nothing, his mind on the thought that not only Macha was in the dun of Dichu. There was Bennett also, but no one seemed to remember this. Unless all is well with the girl, went on Laban, it will be with Kian the Avenger that you will have to parley. Now come with me, and we will lay the whole thing without delay before Leary himself. All right, guys, you did it. I did it. We did it. Good job.